Hey, it's Mike here, and today we're going full fat, in particular full fat dairy, a study that has dairy lovers rejoicing and just pouring nacho cheese all over their body. Kidding, at least I hope I'm kidding. And subsequently, we had an explosion of headlines which included titles such as "The Vindication of Cheese, Butter, and Full-Fat Milk" from The Atlantic, "The Health War Against Cheese May Be Completely Misguided," says Business Insider, which also tells you cheese lovers rejoice. And even Science Daily got in on this with, quote, "New research could banish guilty feeling for consuming whole dairy products." So we're going to do a little bit of an investigation and see if the conclusions that these articles came to and the researchers themselves came to are worth acting upon. Is it worth just letting go and eating as much full-fat dairy as you want? We'll see. All right, first off, here is the original study. It looked at circulating levels of various dairy fats within the blood of subjects, which is supposed to be a better indicator than just asking people how much dairy they eat. And their findings, which are associations and by definition not deemed fit to determine causality, were that most of the dairy fats were not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or mortality. The results were a little mixed though. Articles really like to push how one fat was associated with lower stroke risk. However, they completely forgot to mention that that same fat was also associated with an increase in non-cardiovascular mortality. Just slipped my mind. I don't know. But that's pretty notable considering it's every other type of death besides cardiovascular disease. And moving on, I will say that a lot of the articles are repeating this same point, almost as if it's like a dairy industry talking point, and that is that the study falls in line with increasing evidence. And from Science Daily, the lead author says the same thing. Our findings not only support, but also significantly strengthen the growing body of evidence. A little hiccup though, that growing body of evidence has been mostly from industry-funded studies. Professor Tim Noakes and Nina Teicholz always point to this meta-analysis on saturated fat, which was funded by the National Dairy Council. They're like, we're sitting upon a sturdy, steaming mound of industry-funded science, and it's growing. Gets stinkier every day. And that's what my initial thoughts were when I was reading these headlines was, oh, another industry-funded study. And then I started scrolling through it, and I didn't see the familiar National Dairy Council anywhere there. However, the lead author does disclose some conflicts of interest, such as those from AstraZeneca, a pharmaceutical company that sells statins, which is a cholesterol-lowering drug. You know, I wouldn't put it past pharmaceutical companies to try and make people believe that they should eat more cholesterol-raising food so that they'll end up taking more statins. But this just seems a little bit indirect here. We're talking about consulting conflicts of interest. I wouldn't super trust what somebody's trying to tell me about health when they literally have some pharmaceutical money in their pocket right now. It's just a little sketch. And if he is really a legit dude, maybe he should have thought about that first. And finally, looking through this list, other than the Haas Avocado Board, there are so many conflicts of interest that it's not impossible that there is some dairy-related relationship hidden somewhere there. That is completely speculation, but I feel like it's worth mentioning. So at this point, we can assume one of two things, that A, the team has hidden some type of dairy conflict of interest, or B, that these are legitimately the results that they found. But last point on the conflicts of interest, it is interesting that this same research team has researched some dairy fat in the past. They researched one of the same fats, in fact. And here's that study from 8 years ago. But why? Do they really just want to get down to the bottom of how healthy dairy is? They're just passionate about dairy? Just got a little dairy passion? Do you make a career studying dairy fats just because you're curious? I don't think so. Now, quickly, I want to go over how they may have achieved the results that they got if their results were a little bit skewed. Then we'll go into what the results would mean if they are 100% legitimate and actually represent the real data. I personally just finished my statistics course for my master's in public health, and I can tell you that variables and adjusting for variables is a great way to manipulate the data. For example, obesity would be a variable that is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and mortality. And so you could just adjust for that, maybe over adjust for it a little bit and kind of erase the negative effects of full fat dairy. And it just so happens to be that, yes, they did adjust for not only BMI, but waist circumference, which are two variables of obesity. And I want to mention that obesity is not a fully independent variable here because eating a lot of full fat dairy can make you obese. And while I'm sure there are a lot of dairy industry funded studies telling you that dairy will lower your risk for obesity, Of course, it is a high calorie per gram food, and looking to the Adventist studies in terms of BMI, we see that the vegetarians, whose main difference is dairy consumption, have a BMI that is on average overweight, while vegans average in the healthy normal range. That's the same for the Epic Oxford study. So I think you get the point. They could have sort of erased the negative effects of full-fat dairy by over-adjusting for obesity, and they didn't make the data available, so this again is just speculation. But I do want to say that even if there isn't industry funding, there could definitely be some personal bias here. You just have to look at what the authors say in the Science Daily article. They're pushing for the removal of guidelines against full-fat dairy, so that's their personal mission. And yeah, just because they're guidelines doesn't mean they're automatically correct, but I do want to mention from the European Heart Journal, quote, "There are strong, consistent, and graded relationships between saturated fat intake, blood cholesterol levels, and the mass occurrence of cardiovascular disease. The relationships are accepted as causal." All right, but now I want to move on to assumption B, that these are legitimate, honest scientists, and their data is correct, and the way they statistically analyzed it was also correct. But there are still other reasons that this study and the subsequent articles could have come to a false conclusion, and that brings me to a write-up by David Katz, who is an MD and MPH and a fellow of the American College of Preventive Medicine, which I cannot help but read as facepalm. It's unfortunate. And I want to start by stressing a point that he stresses here, which is that his criticisms are non-denominational. In other words, he is not a vegan, so this is not a vegan perspective. His main points are, firstly, the one that I mentioned earlier, that we're only looking at association, which never proves cause and effect. And secondly, that, quote, "Dairy, whether full fat or otherwise, may not affect risk very much against the backdrop of the prevailing American diet. Because the prevailing American diet is terrible. Eating yogurt is apt to displace potato chips. Cheese might substitute for cheese doodles. Milk may be an alternative to Coca-Cola. What would adding full-fat dairy do to a diet that is optimal to begin with? Cause heart disease." So he says a better suited title to these articles would have been, quote, "Dairy in general, and full-fat dairy in particular, is neither better nor worse for overall health than soda and French fries." In other words, those on the standard American diet are living in an unhealthy food hellscape where the independent removal of one type of food is likely just going to be replaced by another murdersome food. But in terms of actually healthy foods, well, quote, "When, however, saturated fat calories are replaced by whole grain calories, rates of heart disease decline significantly." Now for what I think is the most irresponsible part of the study. Yeah, maybe the authors convinced themselves that saturated fat is healthy, but they go one step further and are actually pushing a trans fat as being healthy. Now, trans fats have been pretty much universally accepted as a bad fat, and the pro-animal fat camp has sort of said, hey, hydrogenated oils with their trans fat are really bad, and they often deny that animal foods have trans fat. Well, from this study, animal trans fats appear to be just as bad for LDL cholesterol, or bad cholesterol, as hydrogenated vegetable oil. Remember how I said these researchers have been studying these fats for a while? Funnily enough, back to one of their older studies, they actually concluded that this same trans animal fat was associated with an increase in LDL, or bad cholesterol. Of course, they tried to box that in with all of these benefits in terms of diabetes and stuff, but still, how irresponsible is it to say that we should be changing the guidelines to eat more trans fat containing foods, a trans fat that you yourself determined raised LDL? Are you cray? And to put everything here in perspective, I want to talk about some other negative effects and negative associations with dairy. We have the hormone effect. From the study, people who drank milk had a rise in estrone, a type of estrogen, and a lowering of testosterone. And we know that higher levels of estrogen can feed cancer. And looking at the Adventist studies, we see that vegans had 29% lower female cancer risk, while vegetarians actually had a 4% higher. And the difference there is dairy consumption. Of course, we are talking about associations. There are a lot of other differences between these groups, but moving on, there is the prostate risk connection as well. This study found that adolescent males who drank milk daily later on had a threefold risk of prostate cancer in adulthood. And finally, we have the very unfun fact that in order to produce all of this milk, we have to keep these dairy cows pregnant. And because of that, they are giving birth a lot. And according to the USDA, 97% of calves are taken away from their mothers within the first 24 hours. It's considered more humane that way. So yes, the dairy industry is the veal industry. Just one more little reason to not eat dairy, because calves are little. So no, dairy is not healthy all of a sudden in this Western world where virtually all 3-year-olds have fatty streaks on their aorta. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to tell people to eat as much full-fat dairy as they want. As for the study itself, the conflicts of interest were a little bit muddy, and it is possible that they over-adjusted for things like obesity, but in the end, it is likely that, again, that hellscape of unhealthy American foods where you pop one unhealthy one out, gets replaced by another one. And until you take a population and actually do an interventionary trial, then you're not going to really get an answer. And we know that we can literally unclog arteries and virtually halt cardiovascular disease in its tracks by eating a whole food vegan diet. That was an interventionary trial, and that was super powerful. And so that's it. And I just want to say thank you so much to all my Patreons for helping me go through this master's in public health. It is super duper appreciated. All right, that's it. Feel free to like and subscribe and share this video in response to people posting those articles, and we'll see you next time.